NMED has agreed to complete a backlog of certificates of completion within a year's time, and I hear it's a little over 200. 200 completion certificates, as well as DOE will be remitting $333,000 to NMED. Some key modifications, which Caitlin Martinez will go into a little in more detail, that was made to the consent order was that there was increased public and federal and local government participation, including a new section that specifies all the requirements. It's also an expanded schedule of cleanup activities and increased accountability of the timely completion through the process for both of the parties. We've revised the dispute procedures that will allow for expedited resolution of issues and perhaps prevent future civil complaints. Fingers crossed, and increased accountability for deferred site status sites. So revisions will provide the public an opportunity to impact the cleanup conducted in Los Alamos labs. It also increases NMED's, our ability to hold DOE accountable for a timely cleanup of legacy waste, and as we see it, strengthens our regulatory authority. With that, I'd like to invite up Caitlin Martinez.
All right, hopefully everybody online can see the screen. Nice to see you guys. Appreciate you joining us on Thursday. I'm Kayla Martinez, and I'm the acting LANL group manager for corrective action at Hazardous Waste Bureau. So pretty much deal with all things under the consent order. So I figured we'd talk a little bit about what the heck the consent order is before we get into all these modifications.
I'm sorry, I should have
Introduced. Oh, yes. Also with me here, we have JD. He's our Hazardous Waste Bureau chief. Super important. Let's keep him happy. And Neelam Dewan, she's the permits group manager for all the hazardous waste. Sure you don't fit. Speak up. Okay, so I thought we'd talk first about, if you can go to the next slide, about the core concept of the compliance order on consent that we're talking about here. And like Rick said, it was a mutually agreed upon document signed between DOE and NMED. This particular one was signed back in 2016. And there was a 2005 consent order before that. This superseded that and kind of re-evaluated how we will tackle legacy contamination cleanup. And that's what these modifications are to, was to that 2016 consent order that we've been working under since then. And essentially the core concept of the consent order is to fulfill the requirements for RCRA, Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, corrective action, and that's also re-implemented under the New Mexico Hazardous Waste Act. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at all of the hazardous releases, the releases of hazardous waste to be remediated, and that includes groundwater monitoring, and other kind of monitoring requirements under Part B permit application. So that's really telling you what it is we're doing. LANL also has active facility permit for current operations, and are regulated all across the board by other people. But this is kind of how Haz Waste looks at these. Legacy contamination sites, and this is our process for working through that. So touching on what the whole purpose of it essentially, and these purposes and scope haven't changed from 2016 to this modified version, but the ones in green we think we did some work to improve upon in these modifications. So first and foremost, the sites under the consent order, there's 1,400 of them. So the consent order is a way for us to get a framework and get a plan of action on how we can actually implement cleanup in an effective way. So that's really what we're doing, and we do that by establishing a priority basis based on campaigns is what we'll call them. So you'll hear that a lot tonight, and I promise we'll go through what a campaign is. And we hold that accountability through milestones and targets in those campaigns. And again, the whole point is we want cost effective, we want tangible work for New Mexicans, we want to get through the legacy waste contamination sites there. The consent order also gives us a way for new site information comes up. We can establish implementation of that. And it just primarily what we want to do is have facilitate cooperation between us as regulators and the facility conducting regulatory cleanup. And then we want an opportunity for the public to be a part of those activities and kind of understand what's happening and have a say in what that cleanup looks like. And for anybody online, the slides are also, if you're having trouble viewing them here, they're on our hazardous waste facility. Won't happen too much. So anyway, the slides are available on the LANL consent order link in our hazardous waste bureau page. So we'll make sure to kind of share those and make them available.
Okay, then we can mention it slide.
Oh yeah, we're moving on to slide 4 now. Okay, so I talked about campaigns, right? How do we take 1,400 sites and how do we plan and prioritize and actually implement this? So we use what's called a campaign approach, and this core concept of it is we use risk-based. The core concept of these campaigns stayed the same, and we use risk-based and we group and prioritize. And those of you that are familiar with LANL, it's there's many mesas, there's many canyons. It's a pretty large facility. So the expanse that we go off of, we use those factors when we prioritize work in that manner. So campaigns, it can be one or more projects, and some of these campaigns are broken up into aggregate areas. So that's kind of where we take a whole, we'll take a whole drainage, we'll take a canyon, and we'll call that an aggregate area, just for us to work on it that way. And the way we kind of hold DOE accountable for these campaigns is they give us deliverables, they show us progress on completion towards remediation of these sites. And those are done either with what we call milestones and targets. So milestones we'll get into a little bit. Those ones are enforceable. Those have stipulated penalties attached to them and are kind of an extra encouraging measure to meet the deliverable on time. And then we also have what we call targets, and these are kind of planning out a little farther with the understanding that things can change and be modified. So those targets are not enforceable. So those core concepts of a campaign haven't changed in the modifications. This is just a map. I was thinking of doing a map of the campaigns, but it turns out that's not as easy of a job as it sounds like. So we'll stick with the good old-fashioned aggregate area maps. And when we go through it, you'll just see how each of the aggregate areas will compose these campaigns. And we'll break them into kind of bigger groups off of these already large groups. And we'll facilitate cleanup through those campaigns implemented in these aggregate areas. We're moving on to slide. Next slide. So the whole reason we're here and we made modifications to the consent order in the first place is because of litigation filed by NMED in 2021. And this kind of resulted, for those that are familiar, we do an annual planning process, and that's where we develop these milestones and targets. And that's where the regulator and the facility get on the same page for what the accomplishments will be. So we were going through that process. We had this what's called an Appendix B that we'll talk more about. But we had a submittal of this proposed schedule of activities for fiscal year 21. And it gave milestones and targets for those. And NMED looked at the proposal and we found them to be deficient. We thought there weren't enough milestones. And we thought the conversion from targets as a FY +1 to milestones the next year wasn't happening the way we would have anticipated that to happen. So following the terms of the consent order, we make best efforts, between the parties of the consent order to find resolution in that. And that's under what we call dispute resolution procedures. So we don't agree, we talk about it and we move forward and we try at different levels of management to satisfy the concerns before they end up where this one did in litigation. So we invoke dispute resolution on that annual planning. We follow the process with tier 1 and tier 2 officials, which we'll also get into a little more later, and just couldn't reach a resolution on that. So that moved us forward, if you don't, next slide, to litigation. So after unsuccessful dispute resolution, NMED, we utilize the statutory authority in the consent order to enforce the terms of that by seeking judicial relief and penalties. So we did that in a civil complaint that we filed against DOE in February 2021. And the core concept was we alleged that DOE didn't comply with the terms of the consent order and that adequate progress wasn't being made according to the terms of that consent order. So we requested that the court provide relief, and what we wanted them to do was require the FY21 Appendix B to be revised, addressing all of NMED's concerns, and we wanted them to assess civil penalties. The other process, that was what we wanted to have happen, and we also discussed that the court could also order the parties to enter court supervised negotiations. So essentially another level of the negotiations and dispute resolution that now are monitored by the court. So we still wanted that monetary penalty for noncompliance. That part didn't change. And after filing our initial complaint in civil court, DOE removed that complaint to United States District Court the next month in March 2021, and that's where all of this litigation has gone under in district court. And their complaints, they answered to our complaint also in that, and they essentially just denied that they didn't comply with the consent order and denied that NMED was entitled to the monetary penalty relief sought in the complaint.
Back one.
Yeah, okay. So then we talked about it this was March 2021 when we moved the complaint. And then by October 2021, we moved for a stay of litigation so we could enter in these court-ordered negotiations. So that both parties, DOE and NMED, went into direct settlement negotiation, and that included our desire to revise the consent order and address the concerns we have on a more long-term basis. So since then, since October 2021, the parties have been ongoing in settlement negotiations, and I know we've all been awaiting the conclusion of this, so we're glad to finally see it come to fruition soon. But we've communicated back and forth since then. We've negotiated revisions to these key sections. And the goal is for NMED to address our concerns that we didn't feel we had appropriate regulatory oversight, and we didn't feel that concerns were being addressed adequately. So these modifications were to long-term impact that and increase our regulatory authority over consent order cleanup activities. So that's where we are now. We got this revised consent order and we got this settlement agreement as a result of those. And now we'll talk through what does that mean essentially. So the settlement agreement, that's what's been signed now by both parties. And the consent order is an appendix to that settlement agreement. So the modified consent order comes along with that settlement agreement. But essentially, this is going to satisfy the claims alleged by NMED without any further litigation. So we'll close our action. And just as a safety, neither party is considered the prevailing party. We both win. New Mexicans win when we have a better consent order. So stick with that. But what the settlement agreement says is that within 30 days of signing the settlement agreement, both parties will execute the revised consent order. So we're just shy of that 30 days now, and we anticipate executing the revised consent order soon. And then the next step after we execute the revised consent order within 50 days. We have to file our stipulation of dismissal, so we'll close that loop. For litigation with prejudice, that's just one of the terms we both agreed to. And then finally, 90 days after stipulating the dismissal, DOE will remit $333,000 to NMED. Okay, so we'll talk about the details of it. Those are the core concepts of what we're implementing in the settlement agreement, and there are other terms in it that we'll go through now. So first and foremost, like Rick mentioned earlier, in the settlement agreement, we agree to complete our review of these, what we call certificates of completion on sites. And essentially those are where DOE has completed the work that they think will get them closure on that particular SHMU or AOC, that particular site. And they need NMED's stamp of approval on a clean, stating that we agree with the conditions in that certificate of completion. So those are essentially the footwork of it that has been completed, and NMED just needs to follow through on the last step of that. So we understand the concern and prioritization for that, and we're going to agree to implement it. There's 221 sites that we need to look through there. Phew, it would keep us busy for a year, but all of those are in attachment B of this settlement agreement. So it'll list all the SHMUs and AOCs that are under the settlement agreement for NMED to complete within the time frame. So we're looking at, since there's 221 of them, we split it up a little bit to keep our sanity around here, and we're doing 50 of them in the first 90 days, the next 50 in 180 days, another 50 in 270 days, and we'll close them all out in that calendar year. So that's a goal. We'll get them done, and that's going to help the consent order show the progress that DOE has made. So we understand the importance of that and certainly prioritize that. One condition is that DOE requested that we do sites under what's called a supplemental investigation reports campaign first. So we'll do that. And we'll talk more about campaigns later, but that's just one of the campaign names. So based on those certificates of completion, what NMED is required to do on those is either issue an approval or disapproval of those COC requests. So disapprovals, we could ask DOE to provide additional information or submit documents that would provide us the information needed to make that determination. And then we add the clarification that there aren't automatic approvals if these review times aren't met. And there are conditions that NMED would have to go through. If we don't meet these, 50 COCs in 90 days, we'd have to send a notification and go through a bunch of steps. But it won't result in an automatic approval of that COC request. So that's really the settlement agreement. Those are the extra conditions. And then we have the modifications to the consent order. So I know there's a lot, those of you that are familiar with it, it can be a lot to take in at once. So we're just going to talk about what the key modifications are, and those carry through to other sections in the document, but we'll focus you guys on the important aspects of it, just to allow you the opportunity for questions and comments. So one of the biggest things and biggest changes for anybody that's familiar with LANL cleanup is that we reevaluated this campaign description and organization. So because of that, we have to revise appendices A, B, and C of the consent order that all relate to that. And we'll talk a little more in detail about that, but that's a significant change that we think is going to help with move progress forward quicker. And one thing we've heard a lot about is the need to increase public participation in the consent order. So we added some conferrals for changes that might affect the priorities of pueblos and local governments, and we try to expand as much as possible this public participation and ability to provide input on consent order in a more regular fashion. And then we also touch on some deferred status sites. That's been something that the state and public has talked about. And we feel we really increase continued evaluation for that, accountability for DOE to evaluate those sites on a regular basis, just to ensure that they still meet the conditions required for deferred status. So part of that now, there's a public notification and opportunity for comment on status changes to deferred. There's conference with pueblos and local governments ahead of deferral status changes. And for us and the public, there's these annual updates that DOE has to provide to the state that really says all the sites that are deferred, what's the progress on moving them back into campaigns, just so we can understand what the holdup is and understand if any of these sites can be incorporated back into campaigns, which is ideal. Then I talked a little bit about our dispute resolution procedures. In the previous consent order, all disputes really led to litigation. You know, there was no line. You either had success in dispute or you went to litigate. So we revised that a little bit, and we want to see a conclusion that doesn't take 3 years for us to have an on like we see here. So those procedures were revised, and then we increased accountability on NMED's part and on DOE's part for review and submissions of documents. So we've heard many times that NMED has had significantly long review times on documents, and we certainly understand the role that we play in completing progress in a timely fashion. Has just as much to do with us issuing the approvals and the necessary documents for DOE to implement the work. So that's something that we think is a success in here, is this accountability on the state's part to review the documents timely. And there's a lot of new requirements we'll get into if we can't meet the review times, and what we're required to do to provide notice not only to DOE but also to the public. All right. So now we'll talk about campaigns. Before, they were all just in a big list on a table in Appendix C. So what we're doing now is we want to split those into what we call Class A and Class B campaigns. And the core concept of this is, can we determine a completion date for all work under that campaign, or can we not? And that's really what the state thought was a priority. If we can determine a completion date, we should, and we should hold DOE accountable to fulfilling that completion date. So that's one of the primary changes. All of our Class A campaigns that you'll see in a revised Appendix C later will specify completion dates on those, and we'll have established completion dates. And those will be subject to stipulated penalties, the same as the previous consent order had a whole consent order completion deadline on it that was subject to stipulated penalties, and now we modified that. And so every completion date on every Class A is subject to that. So we hope that that will help us not only have, and also the Class A we'll talk about has an expanded schedule. So we took it from a 3-year fiscal year planning and we made it a 5-year fiscal year planning. So we're hoping that helps the state better understand and better participate in fiscal year planning, leaning towards those completion dates there. So in Class B campaigns, for anybody familiar with LANL, there's some things like groundwater remediation sites that really, I mean, none of us can make a good decision on when the campaign completion deadline would be for that. So those we filed under this kind of everything else campaign as Class Bs, and those aren't established, but there are provisions for us to reclassify Class B campaigns as Class A campaigns. So for instance, the MDAs would be reclassed as Class A campaigns upon approval of the corrective measures implementation plan. Some of those kind of just same for like groundwater remediation, we would get through the CME and be in that process of implementing a remedy for Class A to be, Class B to be moved to Class A. And TA21 is just kind of one of those odd ones out, and that one will be reclassified after the deactivation and decommissioning work allows the opportunity for that. So those are kind of the primary changes. And we'll talk a little bit about what do we mean by campaign completion. So even though Class A is, we want this 5-year schedule, that campaign completion doesn't have to be in that 5-year schedule. So it can go beyond that 5-year, that's fine, but we do want a date for all Class A's. And we anticipate DOE will develop the successive rolling 5-year schedule carrying each of these Class A's until completion. And some of for campaign completions, we always like to add a little extra just in cases. So there are key assumptions that can be agreed to by both parties that kind of underlie this completion. So it's like throwing an asterisk on a completion date, like just in case. So if like an assumption proves to be incorrect, say they had to have one phase of remediation done by a certain deadline, then but those would be mutually agreed upon. I don't know what that looks like now because we haven't talked about it. We don't have any of those assumptions for me to kind of guide it to, but it's just kind of a little opportunity that we provide in there just in case. And to close it out, DOE will have to submit a campaign completion letter to NMED for approval, and they'll signify that all corrective action activities in that campaign are done. And we got 30 days to give them a response to that. So those are some new things that are added that we hope will help facilitate campaigns in more meaningful manner. So I said we'll see that reflected in Appendix A, B, and C. So Appendix A, I didn't talk about too much because it's just a running tally of all the sites. It gives a site description. So not a whole lot of changes are really happening to Appendix A. The only thing you'll really see reflected in that is we assign a campaign name to it. So if the campaign names change, then we'll change that to match in Appendix A. But other than that, the sites that are being completed under the consent order don't change. They're all the same things in that Appendix A. And Appendix B is where we're going to see the most significant of our changes for those of you that interact with LANL cleanup work regularly. And what we intend to do is split it into two tables under Class B. So we'll have under Appendix B, we'll have a Class A table. We'll list them all out, and that will have a rolling 5-year schedule. And what we changed here, instead of milestones for 1 fiscal year, we'll have milestones for 2 fiscal years that are subject to stipulated penalties. So we're really adding another year of our ability to implement that work in a timely fashion. And just to clarify, the milestones, they don't reflect all the work DOE completes. They do lots of regulatory requirement work year, but these milestones they're intended to show significant progress towards completion of these campaigns, and those are what we call our significant progress. So we like seeing those milestones expanded, and we like seeing the commitment for significant progress extending beyond 1 fiscal year. And Class B campaigns will look pretty much the same. So we'll have our usual 3-year schedule. We'll have 1 year of enforceable milestones and 2 years of targets on that. And Appendix C, we talked a little bit about. This will have a lot of revisions into it, and we'll clarify with a table which are Class A, which are Class B. And they'll have the campaign descriptions. So those will be updated. Some of these we had like, for example, the groundwater remediation sites, we would have under interim measures, and then we would have a final remedy. So we kind of merged those together and made it one campaign. So all of those campaign descriptions will change to match. And it'll have the campaign completion dates. And what we wanted to have included was kind of an explanation for the ordering, right? We want these campaigns done on a priority basis. So we want a little bit of an explanation on what is being prioritized, the way it's being prioritized in Appendix C. And we think that'll help with public understanding of what we're implementing and why we're doing it in the manner that we are. And one of the big things is expanding Pueblo and local government involvement in these Appendix C changes. And what we do if we are changing in future the ordering of campaigns under Appendix C, then we would allow the Pueblo and local governments the opportunity to comment ahead of that change, which we think is important. The public, you guys go to our public meetings once a year and you hear us say what the changes are, but that's really in an after the fact basis. So this gives at least Pueblos and local governments the opportunity to comment ahead of those changes. And deferred sites is one. I'm going to first explain what a deferred site is because I don't think it goes across all the DOE complex. But at LANL, deferred site is a site, SHMU or AOC is what we call them. And it's where all the corrective action activities are suspended due to these circumstances. And we'll talk about what the 4 circumstances that these can be delayed are. One of them is if they're located within testing hazard zones or active firing sites at LANL. There's no point in remediating something that's going to get dirty again from an active firing site. So we allow those to be deferred till closure. And if it's associated with active facility operations, it can't be remediated to completion. So sometimes drain lines will run underneath active buildings, stuff like that, and we won't, have them tear down the active building to remediate the drain line. We'll wait till closure of that active operation first. Another one, if the sites are located on a property not owned by the DOE and that DOE can't obtain access to, we do make a point that we like to see DOE try to gain access if a site is on property not owned and controlled by DOE. And in the event that they cannot gain access, and we'll accept that as a reason for deferral until access can be granted. And then the last one is if NMED issues an approval on a rigorous facility investigation, work plan, or report. So rigorous facility investigation work plans are where they tell us what work they're going to do and we issue an approval, and the report that comes after tells us what they did and we issue an approval. So if in either phase of that DOE notes in the report that the site has access issues or has one of these things that qualify as a deferred status site and NMED issues an approval, then that's a reason to be deferred and change status on the appendix. So there's not a lot of reasons we push off work. We like to see everything happen as it can, but there are circumstances and we allow for it. So now that you all know what a deferred site is, we'll talk about the changes that were made to that. And what we did was we expanded notification requirements on status changes. So in the event DOE intends to change a status to deferred using one of those first 2 circumstances on there, which are either testing hazard zones or active facility operations, then they need to notify NMED in writing of the status change at least 30 days prior to implementing that. And they have to confer with representatives from the 4 core pueblos. And any other municipality, county, or pueblo that shares a common border with LANL. So we want the parties that are directly impacted by LANL cleanup operations to have an opportunity to comment on those status changes. And if there's any points of disagreement, that's something that the parties would consider prior to making that status change. And then finally, after all that, we have to notify the public by publishing that status change on both the facility website and on NMED website, at least 20 days prior to the status change. So that gives the public the opportunity in advance of that to know what's going on, why it's happening, and have an opportunity to ask questions and comment. And our big one is now this annual written update for us. Deferred sites before was kind of this black box of it's deferred, and when DOE says that they're ready to be implemented back into corrective action, they will. So now for us, we want a mechanism to hold them accountable for that, make sure that they are looking at deferred sites and aren't just kind of putting it off till the end of cleanup here. So that's what this annual written update will do, and it'll explain actions taken in that calendar year to attempt to move sites out of deferred status. And then another thing we required, since we don't have control over some of these designations to deferred, is we want a certification annually that imminent and substantial endangerment to health and the environment hasn't resulted and won't result from those sites remaining under deferred status for the year. So just a little accountability for us to feel sure that those deferred status sites won't be impacting human health or the environment while they remain under deferred status. And one of the big things we've heard all the time, that public participation needs to be expanded. And how we tried to do that, we had everything that was in there before is still in there. So all the usual public meetings, the quarterly updates, none of that has changed or been taken away. But we also, so that includes annual public meetings we have on the appendices A, B, and C. The same public comment period on statement of basis, the NMED issues, the same maintaining all of the data and analysis from environmental media collection at LANL on a readily available site for the public, which is in TELUS. All of that is still there, but we added these ones in green. So one thing that we added was email notifications to the public, not just to the state, when groundwater analytical data, like concerning trends, if they were exceedances in some instances, things like that, that the public could be notified directly of that and kind of understand and not have to go through the regulator in that instance. Still the same quarterly public meeting. And we also added an email address that DOE will maintain that will be specific for the public to submit comments to DOE on the consent order at any time. So just allowing a safe space for your comments to be heard and received by DOE. And those comments will take into account, hopefully on a regular basis, for potential future modifications in the consent order. And then something else we added that I'll get into is this new public input for and public access to independent third-party audits on the efficacy of this consent order. So we'll get in there. And one other thing we added was a mandatory 10-year review. And this is something that happens at other sites. So what we do is we want to review and evaluate the consent order at least every 10 years, just to make sure if modifications are warranted, that we have a space to do that on a prescribed basis. And we also have those independent third-party audits along the way. So that 10-year review will utilize the results of any audits done in that 10-year and will facilitate modifications based on that if needed. So I talked a little bit about increased Pueblo and municipality participation, but what does that mean really? So there are 3 instances that we added where these key changes with Pueblo and local governments need to be discussed. That's for any future proposed modifications to the consent order. If we're talking between the parties and we think a modification is going to happen, then we will notify Pueblos and we will notify local governments what we think those modifications look like, for an opportunity for input and comment on that. I talked about the changes in campaign prioritization, and Appendix C would require advance notice. And I talked about deferred status change. So those are 3 instances where we will notify Pueblo and local governments ahead of time for changes. And then we look at if the changes in the ordering of our campaigns may affect the priorities. And we just add the limit on not every county and every municipality, because we're all close. We all feel impacted by LANL, but they're ones that share a common border with the facility. And it includes the 4 Accord Pueblos, which is Cochiti Pueblo, Pueblo de San Ildefonso, Santa Clara, and Jemez. And all the comments made during this preemptive public participation will be considered in those modifications. So we hope to incorporate those comments in those modifications when they occur. And then on dispute resolution, what we did was we split disputes up into 2 kind of categories here. And we said they're either going to be a technical argument or they're going to be based on a non-technical, like scheduling and stuff like that. So for technical disputes, we have 2 separate processes now instead of 1. They're intended to only cover engineering scientific matters under a technical dispute. We'll do the same process. We'll do tier 1 officials first, which for NMED is or Resource Protection Division Director. For EMLA, that's the Office of Quality and Regulatory Compliance Director. And we spend 30 days negotiating in Tier 1 officials. If we don't reach resolution with those Tier 1s, we use an expert that's going to resolve the dispute. So this expert is somebody both parties will agree to within 30 days of those Tier 1 negotiations. So the main concept is we don't want to delay the process. If we have a dispute, let's seek resolution quickly so we can move forward in that. So that's what these changes are aiming to do. So we'll do Tier 1, we'll pick an expert, both parties share cost of the expert, so we both have the same kind of skin in the game on that, and we both agree to cooperate fully, expedite document delivery to that expert, any personnel meetings, anything that's needed for that expert to reach a decision. And similar to things we're seeing, they will issue a draft report. Parties have 10 days to comment on that draft report, and then the expert will issue a decision that's binding and on all parties. So a lot quicker of a resolution on technical. And for dispute resolution procedures for non-technical disputes, we'll have an arbitrator. So NMED and DOE, of course, will use best efforts to resolve it internally. We'll have Tier 1 officials, same thing, 30 days. Then similar, we would elevate that to what we call Tier 2 officials. For us, that's our Deputy Secretary of Operations. For EMLA, that's the manager of the Office of Environmental Management, Los Alamos Field Office. And we'll spend another 30 days negotiating under those Tier 2 officials. And so that's similar to what we had before. We had this Tier 1, Tier 2 procedure. So we maintain that for non-technical disputes. And then if we can't do it through Tier 2 officials, then we'll refer the dispute to a third-party adjudicator who will decide the matter. So same thing, both parties have to agree to this adjudicator. It's presumptively going to be a former judge or magistrate, just so they can have a good scope for our discussion. Same thing, we'll share the costs equally. And same thing, the decision of that adjudicator will be a final action. And it does allow a judicial review of the adjudicator decision under the terms of that. So we think those are significant. Those are ways to get us from point A to point B in conclusion and resolution of any disputes that arise a lot quicker than we've seen here in the 3 years it took us to kind of circle back to this modified consent order. So one of the big things for the state is our increased accountability for these new consent order review timelines. And like I said, it's really for us to just facilitate and expedite that cleanup and do our part to make sure that that can happen as quickly as possible. So Appendix D has always provided review timelines that have been kind of recommended review times, and now they are required review timelines. So they have all the list of documents that are subject to NMED approval under the consent order and how long we have to issue a review on that document. In the event we can't meet the deadline, we have some extra provisions we have to go through that just kind of communicates that. So the Secretary of the Environment Department can grant us an extension for good cause. One thing they say is that extension can't go past the number of days you had initially. So if we had 60 days to look at a work plan, we can't have more than 60 days as our extension on it. One of the things that happens a lot is we do informal comments resolution back and forth between the parties. So that's one instance. If we are resolving informal comments between the parties, that would qualify for good cause for an extension for NMED. And we will have to notify DOE in writing within 10 days after the deadline, just communicate with them that we did not meet the intended time frame. And in that notification, we'll give them the reasons why, and we'll give them a new deadline that NMED will meet to approve or disapprove the document. And then we'll post that written notice on our website so everybody knows when we slacked off a little bit, which is fair. And then independent audits. This is one of our last big things I'll bore you with, but The first thing we'll do under these independent audits is a pilot audit. So within 1 year of us executing this revised consent order, we're going to do a pilot audit to kind of talk about how implementation of that is looking. So we'll discuss, you know, what do these audits look like? What are the benefits? What are the burdens to the parties? And just kind of evaluate feasibility of continuing independent audits the way it's intended in this modified consent order. And these are intended just to evaluate the effectiveness of the consent order. So we look at the performance of both parties. That's what this third-party auditor will do. And they will just let us know, are we adhering to the general purposes and scope of the consent order? And same thing, we're going to share the costs equally. We all got to be a part of it. And part of these independent audits will include public scoping meetings where the auditor will meet with members of the public and kind of get thoughts and ideas also on the effectiveness of the consent order for both parties, the performance of both parties. They'll kind of get our scope for this independent audit after reaching out to the public and having these public scoping meetings. So they will incorporate that public feeding and all the lines of inquiry that both parties are going to get under the audit. And same thing, we got to document everything we do in state government. So they'll give us a report and it'll talk about opportunities for improvements, give us some recommendations, best practices, and we'll publish the reports for the public after finalization, same as everything. And we just tried to minimize how many times we'll do the audits because it sounds like a lot of work. So we'll do not once, more than once every 4 years. And then we want the last one, since all the results of the audit have to be included, we want the last one, give us a year before the 10-year review. So as long as it's concluded 1 year before, it can be implemented in that 10-year review. So we think these audits will be a way for the public to have their thoughts on the effectiveness and room for improvement, because we all know, I'm sure there's still more points for improvement in the consent order. Just gives us a way to continually evaluate it and incorporate those in the most productive manner that we could think of. So we hope you will enjoy that. In summary, really, our settlement agreement and this revised consent order increase the responsibility of both parties, which is something I think we can both agree was a success. And that's NMED has to facilitate our effective cleanup with our document reviews, and DOE has to ensure that the cleanup is conducted efficiently and transparently with both the state and the public. The additional provisions really provide NMED the opportunity to have more meaningful impact on the cleanup conducted under the consent order. So, I mean, if you can comment and you can get your thoughts out to people that are going to hear it and incorporate it in phases of this, then we think that helps, you know, increase the impact from you guys showing up and participating. And overall, we just thought these improvements really helped ensure that our cleanup is accelerated. The rate at which cleanup has occurred has been something we've heard, you know, for a number of years. So we hope this will be a step towards accelerating and providing enforceable mechanisms for that cleanup work to be finished before I retire. So we can open up the floor for questions. For people in the room, we have a microphone. People online, maybe do a hand raise and we'll unmute as we go. Thanks for hanging in there. Do you want to talk about the microphone?
Yeah.
You got to turn.
Yeah, okay. Jake Hoffman with New Collection New Mexico. My question's rather blunt. Why is this consent order any good? And I don't think that can be answered until the apprentices issued. And then underneath that, you know, there's a subset to that. I know, well, first of all, I'm a fan of the 2005 consent order. And that was eviscerated by the Martinez administration. So one of my questions is a subset to the overarching question of why is this any good? What is to prevent a future gubernatorial administration from gutting this consent order and reverting back to something that's really pretty poor. And then added questions, I'll stop with this, but when can we expect the appendices? And I myself will reserve judgment as to whether this consent order is any good until those appendices are available.
Totally understand, and let me know if I missed a piece of it for sure. I wasn't around with the 2005 consent order and that conversion of the 2016, but I've heard the same, horror stories about that. And what I can say is that we do think it's a win. I hear that there's still room for improvement, but we think it's a win because we're increasing our regulatory stronghold on that, So there are things that we would like to see change that kind of align more with the 2005 consent order, but we're working under this 2016 and the process to modify it. It's a little less time intensive than the process to do a new consent order. So we went through the process to modify this under the litigation rather than starting. Neil will give you 10 years of history.
I can answer that. 2005 was good, but it had a lot of details which don't matter anymore. We had set 2015 December date to complete it, and it didn't happen. So it wasn't perfect either. And we figured over there we had planned for the entire completion, and 2015 came and went. So to me, when we were thinking of revision, this process works a little better because we have 3 years planning and we are now moving towards 5-year planning. So we can look forward to what's coming and how we can do it. So I didn't think like gutting this totally was a good idea. So we tried to keep what was in 2016 we liked, and I did like the scheduling over more years than going to the end of it, not knowing what's going to happen in the field. But there, and you're right, the meat of the thing is in appendices, which we are planning on doing during the next annual planning process. And we will have input from public on it.
I'll just add, it's not that this consent order can be improved, it's rather that it's woefully incomplete. As presented until there's the appendices. And so at least to me, it's currently a pretty meaningless document until we have those appendices.
We have the process documented. We know we go from this to 5-year planning, and it should happen soon. And at this point, since we haven't done the 5-year planning, we can't really put completion dates, but each campaign is going to have a completion date, which we are looking forward to it. And, there will be some extension justifications which we had always had. And despite that, otherwise, they have to deliver. We will hold it complete. And that's how I see it. And I agree it's not complete because we haven't been able to update B and C, but we had to get the process agreement on the process, which we have. And now we will move forward towards working with DOE. They need to propose a 5-year plan to us on at least A campaigns. And B campaigns are because we have, only reason is we have to go through CMEs, we have to still define nature and extent. Like Chromium is a good example. We still, for years, have not been able to get nature and extent. We've had issues with drilling, we've had other issues. So we do feel that imposing a date, completion date on that is not really right. Till we have nature and extent. And then because our CME process, we go through public and it takes time, a hearing request could happen. So it's hard to predict the dates. And that's why what Caitlin was saying, when we approve the CMI work plans, and obviously when we go through CME, public's going to have a chance to participate here. And then if there's a hearing, we go through it. And then after that, when we submit a CMI work plan, we approve it. Then we can impose a date on it. And then we will move it to Class A and impose a date for PMO.
What I will say is negotiations aren't stopping. We're still going to continue discussion. And for us, it's a big part for us to be in the process of developing these completion dates. We want to make sure that they're not only reasonable and feasible for DOE, but we want to put a little bit of pressure on implementing those in a timely fashion. So part of that under our annual planning, we'll have their proposal, we'll have time for the state to say, here's where we see shortfalls with what that proposal is now, and be able to talk about it in the usual kind of annual planning process we have. So although I hear that and it is incomplete, and that's the part you want to know what's a class A, what's a class B, what can you expect for completion dates on these, and that's heard, and that's something that we really want to prioritize as quick as possible. We don't want to have it waiting out, but we also want to be part of those conversations and the development of that. Make sure that what they are implementing and deciding now is something that can go to completion. We don't want an extension on these campaign completion dates because we, rush the process and they just set a date that wasn't, reasonable or effective. So
I hear there's that 1 year audit, which the auditors aren't going to reach out to public and see what makes the movement. And we would be taking that into account. So from our perspective, we're trying to put everything in the way which is feasible and not just impose dates, which are happened in 2005 consent order. We just really want to, I really want to get to the end of these campaigns, and we're pushing back to it.
Are there any questions online?
Not that I've seen so far.
My name is Joni Ahrens. I'm with Concerned Citizens for Nuclear Safety. Mr. Sheen, we've talked in this room before about the use of the FEM model. Is there any language in the new consent order that the FEM model cannot be used for decision making with regard to groundwater monitoring?
Oh, man. We didn't have that specification in the consent order, and where we're doing that kind of discussion and work is going to be under the specific campaign. So, for instance, groundwater modeling, utilizing FEHM, we'll talk about that in the project basis and under the campaign and deliverables for that. So, the consent order doesn't directly put any limitations on that, but, the state's position has been pretty clear.
Hey, Johnny, I believe you may be familiar with the individual review technical team panel that came out. We were talking about this about a year ago with the RAD Radiation and Hazardous Waste Control Commission. That is in its final stages, but there will be certainly more information about that and what model this technical review team actually said that they thought would be best to be using. It's very similar to what I know you've been talking about, Martha. So
Yeah.
there'll be more of that coming out.
So, but how does CCNS make those comments at this point? We're not notified on when these things are happening. We haven't been able to meet with Inez at all. She's in charge of the independent audit. There's been no communication. We have no input into what data, what reports are they even reviewing? Are they reviewing all the reports about that LANL has drilled these wells with 33,000 pounds of bentonite clay in the bottom of the Century well for Buckman? There's no, I'm feeling the way that this has been presented this evening, that there's less opportunity for public input. There's no way for us to know when consultations are happening with municipalities. I'm very concerned about the municipalities because they don't have that generally they don't have that historical staff or staff who know the history of what's going on or what has gone on. And because it feels like DOE has more power through this whole process. And we know what happens when DOE does this because we don't have cleanup yet of Area G. We don't have cleanup of MDAC. things have been delayed. Why is DOE even fighting excavation of MDAC at this point? So I'm gonna just say one more thing right now is panel 12 at WIP is reserved for New Mexico legacy waste. And LANL doesn't have the inventory right now to fill up panel 12 with legacy waste in order to protect the groundwater drinking water aquifer. And to get the waste out of the ground that's moving to the aquifer. That's point number one. And so under the WIP permit, there's extra pressure. I'll start again. There's requirements, there's an opportunity under the WIP. I'm sorry?
Sorry, person joined.
Under the WIP permit, there's an opportunity to get a lot of waste off the hill that is contaminating and moving and migrating to the regional drinking water aquifer. And we need to start planning for when panel 12 will be available in the WIP site. And right now, that's 2028. So we have 4 years to get the waste and to create the inventories through the legacy waste, the legacy true waste disposal plan, which is under discussion right now and in public meetings. We want to see an inventory that can go to WIP. We want to see it sooner than later, and part of addressing the cleanup at the cleanup at LANL needs to keep that in mind as well. For legacy waste, not newly generated waste. Okay. I have other questions too, if nobody else has any questions.
Well, I was gonna start just by saying the independent review team that we have going on right now and the independent audits under the consent order are not aligning, right? So this is where we saw room for improvement to have this public, scoping period under independent audits, because we think that's an important piece of it, right? And that we have our position, DOE has their position, but the public has their position, right? So I understand the frustration with the independent review team, but that was being handled outside of what we are expecting these processes under an independent audit to look like. So we hope to at least partially address that.
Thank you.
And then we will, when they release, have public comment.
That was a suggestion from the legislatures. We had a RAD Health committee and we presented there and LANL presented. So the senators said that the independent review panel, because we are stuck on technical differences in prominent thema. So that was the reason. And as far as MDAC is concerned, NMED's position, we issued a statement of basis. We do want to. And the DOE has requested a hearing and we go through the process and see what happens. Our preference is obviously to clean it up. It is more expensive, but the waste was put in there by DOE. And we feel DOE has to be responsible and remove it.
Yay. Okay, then I have, I wanted to ask about the notices under the deferred sites. Under the deferred sites, notice is provided notify the public by publication on, by DOE and NMED. So will NMED use the facility mailing list to notify folks, or is it publication in newspapers, or what kind of method is going to be used?
The requirements of the website post, but I
And
don't
we
think
can address it. I mean,
disagree.
there are going to be so many public meetings, every quarter, DOE has cleanup forums. So I think it can be addressed. There'll be a lot of interaction with public, but we were not thinking of sending it to anybody. And we were just thinking of posting it on our website and DOE would post it on their website.
Okay, then you need to fix your calendar because it's horrible. It's horrible. It's horrible.
We pick it up.
Okay. And then DOE, will DOE send it out? Will DOE send out the notice through the, what is it called? Electric Public Reading Room? That's a question. I mean, how does the public get notice? I'm really concerned about, I don't know how many people use NMED's website to get notice. And Deborah Reed is going to be all over this, just so that you know.
I see the benefit of sending out a public notice on that, you know, because we have a time limit for receiving public comment on that. I certainly don't think the state, at least on our end, it's not a requirement for DOE, but we don't have issue with, you know, a formal notification to the facility mailing list.
We can do it.
Okay. But you know, just by email, right?
Yeah, email or mail, it's whatever people sign up for, right?
So I'm concerned about that this is a modification to the consent order. And one of the questions I have is this a class 3 permit mod? Is there supposed to be public comment? We had public comment for the 2005 consent order. We had public comment for the 2016 consent order. And now there's no public comment on this. We were able to review the entire 2005 consent order, which I brought tonight, just in case anybody wanted to see, and the imminent substantial endangerment determination. Very concerned about this process. It feels like there's some shortcuts that are going on and we need access to be able to comment on a new consent order, or else it's a class 3 permit mod. And I know that you're going to say it's not a permit, but it is under RCRA, which could be considered a modification.
So in 2005, consent order, I don't remember too much about that, I was listening. But 2016, we didn't put it out for public comment. We received public comments after it was signed. This is signed between two parties. I don't think we had any public comment period for it.
There was a 45 day public comment period. Let me see if I have mine.
Because I don't think any changes were made based on public comments. I do know our website has all those public comments received, but I'm not sure we made any changes based on it. And so, you know, it's a consent order degree between two parties by the judges, by the courts. So I don't think there was any time for any room for public comment and changes.
Okay, so we had a public comment period for the 2005 consent order. And there was a response to comments that were released on March 1st, 2005. And that's the day that everybody gathered at the Roundhouse and the big signature took place in the Rotunda. Okay, with regard to the 2016 the consent order, there was a 45-day public comment period from March 30th, 2016 to May 16th, 2016.
What I would say is under the consent order, and I hear that was, you know, public participation in advance of implementation of a new consent order, right, under the 2016. So I know the state, when we issue consent orders, we like to follow similar processes, right? We like to see the NMAX and the class, you know, we want that same public participation, but the consent order has a clause in the 2016 that says modifications. If it were a new consent order, then I think we would have different procedures, right? But modifications aren't subject to this class, you know, class modifications that you're referring to in the regs.
Like the settlement agreement doesn't say modify. This settlement agreement does not, from what I saw, it doesn't say modify. The only place I saw modified was on this cover sheet where it's yellow highlighted, or the modified date. And so there needs to be some kind of explanation what modification means with regard to what that means. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think modification and I can like check and make sure there's no definition, but the settlement agreements, the revisions to the consent order were part of it, you know, so I mean, they're not, I kind of see it as this is those modifications and revisions. I think the language really, to me, aligns on what that is, but the consent order is pretty clear that they just don't have to follow those. And what we want to do is we don't want to get rid of public input on it, right? These are the consent order that's signed between the parties, and the parties are the ones that need to agree to it. But the independent audits are where we say, you know, within a year from that, and by then within a year, we will have all the campaign, you know, all the associated appendices completed and ready for review, and all of that can be incorporated in this first year audit. You know, we want to take that position and we don't want to ignore it, right? But specifically, the consent order just has that clause that says modifications aren't subject to the same comment period requirements under the NMED that I know you're talking about. And that's what the new consent orders, that's what we follow when we implement a new consent order. We do public participation following the NMED. I hear you.
In 2016, you made any changes, basically, but I wasn't going to get that gave 45 days. But if we did, I know we can make any changes. Maybe one change was this public meeting we have annually to say after we have agreed on things. It's just an information purposes, but on the record.
Yeah, I looked at the actual, I saw that on your website.
I know we received comments, and there were just comments, but I don't realize.
45-day comment period, and so this is a process that's been going on for 20 years.
So, well,
Actually, 2002 it started. 2002 it started, after this year running fire.
Or we think we expanded, you know, we didn't take away the concern for modifications to it, right? We didn't.
Right.
But what we did do is this advance notice and discussion of this, you know, in the event future modifications happen, you know, and notifying the public what those are. And
I would suggest when the independent audit happens, they're supposed to reach out to public. And by that time, you will have appendices, and that would be the kind of content. Because that's what the audit is supposed to do, to see if it works. And sometimes it's good. That would be the time.
But if we look at the example of the legislature's audit, nobody's reached out to the public that I know of.
that is different. That is, you know, some we've had, and when we do put it for the public, make it publicly available. You know, we will have meetings and we will, there's a plan of action for that particular thing. But we did solve that, and I hear the differentiation in that, and that was just from a different thing, not from a consent order independent audit, you know, but we want that to be a part of it, what is required in future under the consent order for these type of independent technical review type.
Right, I understand, but we don't even have connection, any information to be able to submit anything to the legislative audit committee. Let's just call it that. Like, I don't even know if they have the NAS report that says many, if not all, of the groundwater monitoring wells at LANL are insufficient to detect contamination. And so then we get into this whole thing, if it's not included in the audit process, then there's no documentation and the contamination continues to move to the regional aquifer. You know, it's more than just the administrative part. It's LANL contaminants are migrating every moment to the drinking water aquifer, for the region.
For the IRT, we did, the state spent a lot of time making a significant list of all the documents we thought were important, and we really gutted our admin record to provide them everything we think they could possibly need, and let's get, these nice advanced academic minds really diving into the details. So at least from our position, we hope we included everything that you think would be important, and we really did try to provide everything I thought was even half relevant on our admin record. We sent over, and we had meetings to discuss and points to ask questions and points of clarification for them. So I do hear that concern, but I think we tried our best to make sure that we represented the public's position from what we've heard with this chromium plume and what we've heard for years of your guys' issues with it. So I know that, and we know your thoughts, and we really hope that what we provided and the result of that will, satisfy concerns.
And our concerns are documented in the NMED consent.
Let's also talk about well, all of that in the scope, if you were there, the scope of what they're covering is significant, specific to the chromium plume, but they cover well construction. They do cover a lot of these things, the modeling, all these things that you're talking about are aspects that we asked them to evaluate and are things that we provided enough information for them to make a decision on that from both parties. So we'll see, fingers crossed, but.
Does anybody have questions online?
No questions yet online. If anyone is online, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand. I'll unmute you, or you can add it to the meeting chat and I'll read off the question. Also, anybody phoned in should be able to.
If there's anybody. I have a question, and the answer can't be in writing just by the nature of the question. I want to get to the intent of NMED with this consent order. And I do that by noting, and I'm going to oversimplify, but most of the milestones for the 2016 order, I would describe them as being paper milestones. They were a study on this and a study on that. And then that was like half of them maybe. And then another quarter would be drill a monitoring well. So again, I oversimplify. But is it the intent of NMED to actually compel actual cleanup? That's the thrust of my question. Are we going to get cleanup out of this consent order instead of, spending a couple hundred billion taxpayer dollars every year and getting paper studies? So are we going to see actual cleanup?
That's what we're hoping. The dispute will take us there, and this is where I'm saying what we ended up with before was the state expressing concerns with these exact things you're saying and the significance of the milestones, the timeline of cleanup work. These were all the things that brought us to this lawsuit, right? And we haven't taken a step back from the position that those need to be changed. Those are the aspects we need improvement on, is, the significance of the milestones and the timeline that we're getting to completion. So that's where we think dispute's going to come in, these dispute resolution procedures. And now we don't have to end up in litigation for 3 years. We can go to an arbitrator. We can say the state is concerned that progress is not happening according to the purposes and scope. We don't think it's sufficient. Here are our reasonings for that. And an arbitrator will give us a decision in, 60 days on that matter, rather than us expressing concerns on an annual basis. But I will say this is something that it's not a new fight. We have this fight for you guys every year, and every year we meet with DOE and we say it's a conversion of what is it that they can feasibly do, what is it that they will make commitments to, and what is it that the state wants to ask and wants to push for. So, this isn't a new thing, and the core concept of our pushing for that action isn't going to change in the new consent order. We just think now that we have a solution that'll get us one step closer to actually achieving this.
So you're putting these drilling work plans, which as series of insignificant, they are defining the nature and extent that we can get to the CDB for chromium, and we are only seeing for chromium because that is top priority. And then we have some progress reports. And that for me, I'm the one who suggested progress reports, is to see the progress. They go 1 year. I don't want to put a milestone or a target 3 years out that this report for this aggregate area is supposed to come. And when we get to 3 years, we didn't get to. So progress reports are just to let us know that they've been out in the field. They have collected so many samples and they will be submitting the report next year. So we're getting endpoints from these aggregate areas. There are IR investigation reports that are being submitted based on these milestones and targets. The only thing is chromium. Chromium, we can't get to the, actually DOE is being pushing for us to approve the CME for chromium without having the nature extent. And I cannot bring myself to approve a CME without even having the data. We don't know the vertical extent. We don't know the extent towards the east. We don't know the extent on Sinai, which we are addressing now. And that is why you're seeing all these wells, because we do consider them important milestones to get to this. But there are some which are just periodic monitoring reports and I need to get those out. Right. But we have gotten quite a few out of the way, which is routine groundwater monitoring, but we kept it in because it's important that the annual groundwater monitoring plan gets approved. And we kept for chromium an annual report, so we know what has been done so far, so we can keep track of it. Chromium is a complex project and it's now going to finish in a year or two. So if we put completion dates as the only milestones or targets, we haven't get there. So we are keeping an eye, we're keeping an eye like getting these small chunks of stuff. Otherwise, at the end, it's going to be there. We don't have to next year. We've been asked for CME approval 3 or 4 years. We are not doing it. You see, the appendix B keeps getting pushed out till we have nature and extending. Chromium has been one project where every time we drilled a well, we've had more questions than answers. It's like suddenly we did our 70 and now we don't know the vertical extent. So it's just the way, and these wells are pretty expensive. We're always spending $7-8 million per well. And without having the knowledge, we don't the same.
So no, I understand, but so we hope to improve on that. And I mean, really, these processes are still going to happen and we still need to have these negotiations. And these are going to be, I doubt we're going to solve all of our issues now, and we're going to have meaningful milestones every fiscal year. We're going to have fantastic targets that reach us to deliverables timely. Like, I think it's going to be continued discussion, and I don't think the state's battle with maintaining and holding steady on requiring these deadlines is over. But we'll have that happen under the annual planning, and we'll push for it the same way we have been.
And we are so disappointed with the progress. This waste has been sitting out in my margin for so long. And that's the reason we went to litigation, is because we are unhappy with it, trying to find mechanisms, because they have funding constraints. As you heard, which will cost so much. So we are trying to find a way to move forward. And I think with this 3-year planning, at least for aggregate area, we have made something. Some of the aggregate areas are there. So it's RDX and chromium are going to be long-term projects. I'm happy with the progress we have because we have progress reports, the reports are submitted, and if there is any residual contamination, we want to the next phase.
I had a question. Just Scott.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Tom. Thank you. My name is Scott. Go back with him to live in New Mexico. I appreciate the work you guys are doing on this. I'm trying to just clarify the public input access to third-party audits. You say that the independent report for the chromium is not covered, it's not an audit. Is that right?
Not under the consent order, it's not an independent audit.
So there's some new audits, like the yearly audit that you mentioned, that's
First
first year.
year, there'll be an audit. which would, the auditor would reach out to public and see what you see with this consent order. Patients need to be making, instead of making it all okay.
Okay, so
We are
that's,
doing it in good faith, hoping things will work.
so that's what the public input and access to third-party audits, it's referring to that.
And then maybe another 4 years, there may be another one, and then 10 years would be a review, which would take on this part. It's kind of, I don't know if you got familiar when we did such the supplemental pricing from one of them is a triennial review where LANL hires independent people, and they've come up with a lot of, shortcomings, which LANL has to fix with the users. So what is that?
Okay.
In the independent technical review that's happening now, we developed a scope between the part, like this we developed for all independent audits that'll happen under the 2016 consent order separately. But this chromium plume that we did with the red has, we sat and we developed lines of scope for that. We developed the review panel members. So we took a different path to that, kind of separate from what we're trying to develop under the consent order, because this wasn't finalized and we needed to facilitate some kind of technical review while we were still negotiating terms of the consent order. So, I mean, these were partially lessons learned in how we developed the independent audits in the consent order and those modifications. But those are different. We developed a totally different scope for that chromium plume independent review team. We picked a panel, mutually agreed. We split the cost probably and all the same.
So as yours, but, we raised the concern that contamination is being moved vertically down. And the DOE does not agree with us. And, we've sent them and they shut down. We told them to shut down injection because we don't think the injection sites are good. And the DOE chose to shut down the entire system. And now contamination concentrations are going up. And that's the reason, because we were at an impasse.
We don't need to talk about that.
No, we don't. I'm just saying that we were at an impasse, and that's where the independent.
We will post those and we will have an opportunity. I know everyone wants to know what's going to happen with the IRT. We all want progress on plume cleanup. We're with you on that. And I promise as soon as we can make it publicly available, we will. And we do want to hear your guys' response to that. And we'll do meetings on that.
We cannot extract.
It's a water balance. You gotta take out what you put in, all this stuff. So we hear the constraints.
It's been 2 years. If DOE was listening to us, we put a common alternate way to build about injection well away from that site. So it's not that we have a disagreement, and that's the reason we went to this independent. We're getting scientists who are doing, why not the and hopefully we can all look at it because we have this.
Just to continue to complete that. Deliver to shut down.
They did have regulatory direction to shut down well. All of that is true. But I think what we need to well, I think what we want to focus on is the success of it, and whatever we have out of that, we will have a solution that the parties agree we'll move forward with, right? So, I mean, there's going to be technical agreements. This isn't going to be the last. In the next 10 years, we're looking at this. It's not, so what we're hoping is a different solution than the concerns you guys are bringing up with the IRT and stuff. That we hear that, we're trying to solve that, but we're hoping long-term, we're finding a better path forward to get us to resolution quicker, so we don't have years of these, yeah. So this would qualify in future under a technical dispute if we were to disagree, and we would do a similar process where we would solicit an expert to issue a decision on that. So we're trying to keep similarly to what the consent order is doing by having that process, but there are two different things. I promise you'll have plenty of opportunity on that. Hope to have solutions soon.
I think we protect.
So is Ted Weicker on the call or Jessica Kunkel? Or are they in the room? Because my questions are for them with regard to, the size. My question is about whether NMED has the capacity to work through all of this additional work that's being brought on by this new consent order. And whether DOE's grant to NMED is large enough to ensure that public health and the environment are protected through this process. Having watched the cycles in the High Hazardous Waste Bureau for long distance, they probably need 4 new people to help through this process. And whoever can take that message back would be appreciated very much.
We don't have grant for the
No, we get
Just
through
have-
permit application.
document reviews.
Yeah, so there's,
Does it mean you don't have a grant?
no, so we get paid under the consent order on each document. We fee them for each review that we will issue and they pay us for it. And then they have their hazardous waste facility permit, you know, that's separate from this, but we don't have a grant. What I would love any and all help, you know, but we've made the commitments and we will abide by the commitments in the consent order, and the state will evaluate what we need in order to do that, and likely more people would be fantastic.
And then where does the $333,000 go? Does it go in the hazardous waste emergency fund?
I think it goes to general fund, emergency response fund. It goes the same process where like usual penalties from other departments would go. So yeah, it's not.
So we need to talk to the congressional delegation about getting money to NMED.
Sure.
Greatly appreciate.
I wanted to add to the fund. And I don't know if there's any lawyers in this room, but you might want to be careful. I see good potential for real cleanup at Area C. And of course, there's the NMED draft order for pretty much comprehensive flow cleanup. I'm going to predict that if NMED sticks to that, DOE is going to sue it. But we'll see. But as things stand, it looks like Nuke Watch will be, quote, negotiating with DOE coming the new year over whatever the final order might be. But to bring this to the consent order, I'm asking, like, what's the intersection between the two? Possible ongoing negotiations over what Area C cleanup will be, how that ends up being reflected in the consent order in general, and more specifically in milestones. But be careful.
So we'll do the usual, like the same process doesn't happen for review. We did the CME, we issued our statement of basis. We allowed opportunity for public hearing on the matter, which is where we're moving. And at the close of public hearing, secretary will make a decision, you know, after the close of that. And then we will require an implementation, a corrective measures implementation report. And that's where the consent order is moving things from Class B to Class A. So we have this CME, we have this public hearing process that doesn't happen, you know, overnight. It takes a while. And then at the end of all this public hearing, we'll put them on a deadline, we'll move it to Class A, and they'll submit the CMI, and that will be reflected in the 5-year schedule under Appendix B.
Until that negotiations has nothing to do with consent order negotiations, it's moving this process. The statements that even two statements of choices, there's a due process. Anybody can request a hearing has been requested. We go through the hearing, whatever decisions are made, we abide by it, and then we, during the annual planning process, when that ends, we start imposing dates. And that doesn't even go to Class B anymore, it's already in Class A because it's in the CME process. So as we will put a date for CMI will plan to be submitted, depending on whatever the decision is made by the hearing officer and secretary gets to decide, make the final decision. So it shouldn't impact this, that's proceeding as it's supposed to. So
The conclusion of the proceedings, whatever it may be, one would think that end up being reflected in the consent order instance.
It will be reflected in milestones at some
once we
point.
get to the point that we can agree on a remedy, then the union will be given a deadline to submit a CMI plan and giving the CMI plans.
But we'll implement, and that's how all the MDAs are gonna work as campaigns, right? They're gonna follow the same process. We'll go through, once we issue a CME. The opportunity for public hearing and stuff, none of that has changed. They just happen under the consent order. We clarify which secretary's decisions, the conclusion of that. You know, we talk about the NMED where we move to that. So there is, you know, a conclusion that is under and covered under the consent order, and then we'll move it and develop all these milestones, and we'll make sure that, you know, it's happening really. But those are all phases that, you know, you guys will see reflected after we get through this hearing process and, you know, get through the CMI phase finally.
Any questions in mind?
Nothing.
Ready to go?
Wait, here we go. So public email, consent order comments to DOE, section 34.A.4. How do public and NMED know what public comments have been submitted? Don't see any requirement that the comments are publicly available. This is from Don Hancock.
I don't know if we have a requirement to make them publicly available, but we do, any significant comments that are submitted, that DOE and NMED will discuss those comments, you know, and what the path forward from those will be. But I don't believe as of now that there is a requirement to post publicly these comments. We just want an avenue for both parties to hear and receive comments all the time instead of just once a year when we have a public meeting. So I think this is something that also will come up in this first year audit, really. These are things that could use a little fine tuning. If it's important for the public to have those comments publicly available, then that's something I think that would be important to include in that independent audit for that auditor to know. But as of now, we don't have that as a requirement, just that both parties will monitor regularly the email and will communicate, you know, comments received in that email.
The DOE is supposed to have a website dedicated to.
It's an email address, so they maintain an email address that you can send a comment to anytime in email, and they're supposed to check that, have a staff that will check it regularly and will communicate those comments to the regular.
But the public comment portal on the NMED website would have to put in the issue in order to make a comment. And so something needs to be adjusted so that people can make comments on the consent order throughout the year.
And that's with the email address. So like the public comment portal is a different thing. So we'll send out, this is like an email that they will monitor and have. So you'll send your comment in an email to this email address that both parties will have access and see. So it won't be on like NMED's public comment portal that way. It will be like this at DOE whatever, you know, account that you'll say, these are my comments, and we will monitor and regularly look at those. And then audits are part of the time where we will evaluate all comments received to that email address.
Okay, and so on the portal page, it needs to say, if you're making comments about this, you send it to this email.
Absolutely.
But then the other part about using the NMED comment portal is that at the beginning, you could look at everybody's comments. And now you can't read those. And that's problematic.
I'll have to look into that.
But it's bigger than just hazardous waste. It's Clean Air Act, it's water issues as well.
We can look into that, for sure, but this will be separate from that public comment portal, and I think that's a good addition to the webpage to just make it clear if that's the comment under the scope, then you submit it in this format. We can do that.
You can put it in your website once we get the comments.
Yeah.
We
We'll talk.
we can talk, we hear the concern.
Because with climate change, people are getting more concerned about the environment. And so they're going to be looking at ways to be able to participate. They may not have been doing recently.
That's good. We do intend to, we're gonna post, we do want to make like a fact sheet. We want to make this readily available for the public and, now is not the time that we're ready to go guns blazing with all this, but we do want to make sure we'll post that link. We'll make sure the email address is available and all of this information as a concise manner on our webpage so people don't have to dig through 200 pages of a consent order to find what they're looking for.
Anybody online or phoned in have any comments or questions? And the people phoning in can they unmute themselves?
Take it as a success, if there's no other, if there is any comments, you guys can always, shoot me an email, give me a call anytime. This is, my full-time job is trying to respond to you guys and your comments on LANL and the consent orders. So, if there are any lingering questions that pop up, which I'm sure there will be, please feel free to shoot me an email. We're here anytime. And as developments continue and as we do implement this consent order, we'll make sure to keep putting things publicly available on our website.
Are you wrapping up? Is that what's happening? Okay, but I just have a comment to DOE that we need to be seriously planning for waste going into panel 12 at WIP. 2028, we need to start developing the inventory that will go there. And MDAC needs to be a priority. So I would recommend that DOE withdraw its opposition to excavation of MDAC and follow Sandia's example that the mixed waste landfill can now be excavated. That there's a real movement to protect drinking water supplies and that this waste needs to get out of the ground because the source of the contamination. And that's for the folks that are on the lawyers and others that are on the screen.
I don't want to respond. We are continuing that, right? We have MDAC that's already in the process. MDAH has a CME submitted. So, I mean, we see progress happening with these MDAs that will kind of lead towards final disposal for radioactive constituents at WIP as required. So we are moving on MDAs. They are making progress on MDAs and hope that continues, at the same pace they have this past couple of years.
Thanks for answering my questions today, Ministry.
Anytime. All right. Well, if there's nothing else online, thank you guys for taking your time. Thanks for taking the time to hang with us on your Thursday night, and we look forward to talking to you guys next time. That's gonna go on forever.